The wreckage smelled like death and gasoline. Lieutenant Marcus Chen stood 15 feet from what remained of a Japanese G4M bomber, watching fuel drip from its torn belly onto the scorched coral of Henderson Field. It was August 1943, and he'd seen plenty of enemy aircraft go down in flames over the Solomon Islands. But this one was different. This one had survived the crash, mostly intact. And what the American engineers found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Betty bomber lay broken on Guadalcanal's airstrip like a massive dying bird, its twin engines still ticking as they cooled in the tropical heat. Chen had arrived with the technical intelligence team just after dawn, when the jungle mist still clung to the mountains and the air tasted of salt and smoke. The Japanese crew hadn't made it. Their bodies had been removed hours earlier, but their aircraft remained, and with it, secrets that would reshape everything the Americans thought they knew about their enemy. Captain Robert Hayworth led the examination. He was a methodical man, a former aeronautical engineer from Boeing who now wore the uniform of the Army Air Forces. Chen watched him circle the wreckage with a clipboard, his boots crunching on fragments of plexiglass and twisted metal. The bomber's nickname among Allied pilots was brutally honest. They called it the Flying Lighter. One good burst from a .50 caliber machine gun, and these things went up like matchsticks soaked in kerosene. Everyone knew it. Yet here lay another one, and the war showed no signs of the enemy changing their design. Hayworth stopped at the bomber's midsection, where the fuselage had torn open. He knelt down, running his hand along the interior structure. Chen moved closer. The smell intensified. Gasoline. Strong enough to make your eyes water. Strong enough to make you wonder why the whole thing hadn't exploded on impact. Inside the fuselage, the fuel tank sat exposed. No armor plating. No self-sealing rubber layers. Just thin aluminum shells holding hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Hayworth's face changed as he traced the tank's surface with his fingertips. The expression wasn't triumph at finding an enemy weakness. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like sorrow. Chen had studied engineering before the war. He understood the constant battle between weight and performance, between protection and range. But this was different. This wasn't a calculated trade-off. American bombers carried self-sealing fuel tanks. British bombers carried armor plating. Even the Germans, desperate and running out of resources, had found ways to protect their crews. But the Japanese had built these bombers with naked fuel tanks sitting in the fuselage like bombs waiting to detonate. The technical team spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. They measured the tank walls, 0.8 millimeters, thinner than a dime. They examined the fuel lines, the pumps, the feed systems. Nothing was protected, nothing was reinforced. One tracer round through the fuselage and the entire aircraft would become an inferno. The crew wouldn't have time to bail out. They would simply cease to exist. Sergeant William Torres found the personal effects around noon. The Japanese crew had carried photographs, letters, small religious charms. Chen looked at the photographs. Young faces, some smiling. One showed a pilot standing next to what looked like the same type of bomber, his hand resting proudly on the fuselage. The man looked confident. He looked like he believed in what he was flying. Hayworth called the team together in the shade of a palm tree stripped bare by artillery fire. The captain explained what they'd found in technical terms. Unprotected fuel systems, no redundancy, maximum range achieved through minimum weight. An aircraft designed to fly far and hit hard with absolutely no consideration given to bringing the crew home alive. But it was what Hayworth said next that changed everything for Chen. The captain pulled out a captured Japanese training manual recovered from another site. It outlined the philosophy behind the bomber's design. Range was paramount, speed was essential, weight was the enemy. And survival, the manual suggested, not from armor or protection,
but from skill, spirit, and the righteous cause for which they fought. Chen felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd killed enemy pilots, shot them out of the sky, watched them spiral down in flames. He'd celebrated those kills, marked them on the side of his fighter. But standing there in the heat, looking at the photographs of dead men who'd flown aircraft their own country had built to burn, something shifted in his understanding of this war. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky orange and red like the fires Chen had seen consume so many enemy aircraft, Hayworth made a decision. They would ship the wreckage back to the United States. Engineers would study it. Tacticians would analyze it. But more importantly, they would try to understand it. Because understanding your enemy's choices meant understanding your enemy's mind. Chen stood alone near the wreckage as darkness fell. The fuel smell had faded, replaced by the scent of jungle vegetation and distant rain. He thought about the pilot in the photograph, standing proudly next to his bomber. Had he known? Had he understood that his aircraft was a flying coffin, that his commanders had decided his life was worth less than a few £100 of armor plating? Or had he believed, truly believed, that his spirit and skill would be enough? Hayworth approached as the last light faded, carrying a piece of the fuel tank they had cut away as a sample. In the dying light, the thin aluminum looked almost transparent, fragile like paper. They both knew what they'd found here wasn't just a technical weakness. It was a window into a way of thinking that would define the rest of this war. A philosophy that viewed death not as a failure to be prevented, but as a potential outcome to be accepted. The question hung in the humid night air. If your enemy doesn't fear death the way you do, how do you fight them? And if their own machines are designed to kill them as readily as yours, what does that say about the lengths they're willing to go to win?
3 months after examining the crashed Betty bomber, Lieutenant Marcus Chen sat in a briefing room in Hawaii, listening to conclusions that made his chest tight. The room smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke. Rain hammered against the windows. Around the table sat pilots, intelligence officers, and engineers who'd spent weeks analyzing not just the wreckage from Henderson Field, but dozens of other captured Japanese aircraft. What they discovered went far beyond unprotected fuel tanks. Colonel James Pritchard stood at the front, his pointer resting on a technical diagram of the Betty bomber's internal structure. The colonel was old enough to have flown in the First World War, old enough to remember when every flight was a gamble with death. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd come to understand something he wished he could unknow. The Betty bomber, Pritchard explained, wasn't poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed for a specific purpose, for a specific philosophy. The Japanese had created an aircraft that could strike targets 2,000 miles away, deliver a devastating payload, and potentially return home. But the potential part was key, because built into the design was an assumption that fundamentally differed from how Americans thought about air warfare. The Japanese had calculated that losing aircraft and crews was acceptable if it meant reaching targets the enemy thought were safe. Chen watched the faces around the table. Some men nodded, taking notes. Others stared at the diagram with expressions that suggested they were seeing something that didn't fit their understanding of rational military planning. An American bomber, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, carried armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy defensive armament. It was built to bring its crew home. The Betty was built to reach its target. The difference seemed small on paper. In practice, it represented an entirely different calculation of what mattered. The engineers who dissected the Betty's remains found something else. The aircraft wasn't just unprotected. It was optimized for weight reduction in ways that suggested the designers knew exactly what they were sacrificing. Every pound of armor they didn't include meant more fuel or more bombs. The math was brutal and clear. Japanese engineers weren't incompetent. They were following orders that came from a military culture that had made a fundamental decision about the value of individual life versus mission success. Pritchard moved to the next slide, showing casualty rates. American bomber crews had roughly a 50-50 chance of surviving their tour of duty. Painful odds, but odds that the military worked constantly to improve. Japanese bomber crews in the Pacific had far worse survival rates. Not because they were less skilled, not because they faced tougher opposition, but because their own aircraft were designed in a way that guaranteed high casualties the moment they encountered resistance. A Navy intelligence officer named Commander Patricia Walsh spoke next. She'd been studying captured documents, interrogating prisoners, piecing together the cultural context behind these decisions, design decisions. Her findings were disturbing, not because they were monstrous, but because they were logical within a completely different framework of values. The Japanese military drew from samurai traditions that emphasized honor, duty, and acceptance of death. A warrior who feared death was already defeated. Applied to modern warfare, this philosophy meant that protecting individual lives was less important than achieving collective victory. Walsh explained that Japanese pilots were taught that their aircraft were extensions of their spirit. The machine's shortcomings could be overcome through skill and determination. To demand better protection was to admit weakness. It was a mindset that made perfect sense within their cultural context, and absolutely no sense to Americans who'd been raised to believe that protecting your soldiers was a moral imperative. Chen felt something like vertigo. He'd been fighting this war for 2 years. He'd reduced the enemy to simple terms. They were the bad guys. They needed to be stopped. But sitting in that briefing room, he realized the truth was more complicated. The men who died in that Betty bomber hadn't been sacrificed by commanders who didn't care. They'd been sacrificed by commanders who believed they'd agreed to the sacrifice. The horror wasn't that the Japanese military was cruel. The horror was that it was sincere. The briefing continued. They discussed tactics for exploiting the Betty's vulnerability. Aim for the fuselage. The tanks will ignite. One good burst is usually enough. The information was tactically valuable. It would save American lives. But Chen couldn't shake the feeling that every Betty they shot down was as much a victim of Japanese military philosophy as it was of American firepower. Pritchard ended with a warning. Understanding the enemy's mindset was crucial, but also dangerous, because understanding could lead to respect, and respect could lead to hesitation. The Japanese military had made choices that placed mission success above individual survival. Those choices made them predictable in some ways, vulnerable in others, but they also made them incredibly dangerous, because an enemy who doesn't fear death will take risks that seem suicidal. As the room emptied, Walsh approached Chen. She'd noticed his expression during the briefing. She told him something that stayed with him for the rest of the war. The greatest tragedy wasn't that the Japanese built aircraft without armor. It was that they'd created a culture where asking for armor would be seen as shameful, where self-preservation was reframed as selfishness, where young men climbed into flying coffins and called it honor. Chen walked out into the rain. It was cold for Hawaii. Somewhere across the Pacific, another Betty bomber was probably burning, its unprotected fuel tanks turning it into a fireball. He would shoot down more of them. He would mark more kills. He would do his job. But he would never again see those kills as simple victories. The Betty bomber's design wasn't a mystery anymore. The engineers had their answers. The tacticians had their weak points to exploit. But Chen had found a different kind of answer. He'd learned that the cruelest thing about war wasn't the enemy trying to kill you. It was discovering that the enemy's worst wounds were often self-inflicted, born from beliefs they'd been taught were virtues. Understanding your enemy, Chen realized, didn't make them easier to fight. Sometimes it just made the fighting harder to forget.